Thank you for being with me, everyone. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years. And I was introduced to this practice during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and panic disorder. And my panic disorder had blown up into agoraphobia. I was unable to leave the house. I was on disability and was fortunate enough to get paired up with a psychologist who even back in the late 90s was several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And that was my beginning in this practice. And no one was more surprised than I was when it actually helped. And it has continued to help. And so I have continued to do it. Now I'm to the point where I've been teaching for the last few years and have become a grateful part of this cycle of sharing these teachings that have so profoundly impacted my life, other people's lives, so many lives over the course of millennia now, right? These teachings largely come from the historical Buddha from 2,500 years ago, as they've been passed around the world and through oral tradition, written tradition, so many different languages, cultures, times. And we're all a part of that. We're all part of that. So this is the next in my ongoing series of calming anxiety by living mindfully. I'm looking forward to today's as always. This is actually a technique that I'll be presenting today that I was just using yesterday during my sitting. And when I was thinking about what I'd like to offer today, that came to mind. I was like, oh, let's roll with that one. So let's jump in. Okay? As always, I like to begin my sitting by imagining I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head as a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If there's some tension right now, the body, the mind, that's fine. We can allow that tension to be the tension that it is. There's no need to try to force it away, which is really just bringing more tension to the tension. In my experience, that does not result in a decrease of tension. Bringing more tension to tension does not generally get rid of tension. So if there's some tension here, it's allowed to be here. It's allowed to be here. And it's allowed to leave in its own time. And that may or may not be today. I also like to notice what is beneath me. A chair, a cushion, floor. Something is supporting me, holding me up. And I can allow it to do so. There's a sense of grounding beneath me, even if I don't feel particularly grounded at the moment. Let's take a moment and notice this support, this grounding beneath us, and this suspension from the ceiling at the top, and whatever else happens to be here for us right now, in between the two, however it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. We may begin to start to shape or control our breathing when we bring our attention to it. Perhaps because we think it needs to be a certain way, or perhaps simply because it's difficult not to shape or control the breathing in some way when we are bringing our attention to it. We don't need to shape or control it in this practice. Our meditative breath is simply the breath that is happening as we are meditating. Whether it's long or short, deep or shallow. It counts either way. It's simply the breathing that is here. And if there is some controlling or shaping happening, well, that's the controlling or shaping that is here. We don't have to try to control the controlling any more than we need to bring tension to tension. We can simply notice that it is here. And this is what it's like. You may choose to notice the rising of the in-breath. The dropping of the out-breath. And space in between. You may choose to notice this, the nostrils, back of the throat, chest, stomach. Notice the movement, the shifting. See if you can notice the movement of the breathing. In some spot, or through several spots. but keeping the attention wholly focused on that breathing, on that process. Just that one thing. Now, one of the challenges that some of you may have already run into is how the mind offers us all these chances to be pulled away from this breathing process. To capture our attention with something other than where we have decided to focus it. Thoughts, ideas, memories, worries, desires, fantasies. I find it helpful when these come up to see each of them like it's in its own bubble. Perhaps it's a big thought. Or a big feeling, or a big worry. It's in a big bubble. Perhaps it's not so big. Just a random passing thought. Little bubble. The bubbles move. Up, down, side to side. They float around. But they're all self-contained. And there's space around them. I mean, there has to be space around them if they're moving, right? And that space is filled with our breathing. The bubbles are not us. They're not ours. They're just movements in space. The breathing is not us. The breathing is not ours. But it's still here. And it's filling that space. Providing the space. Making the space. And the bubbles are allowed to be here, in the space. And as we watch our breathing, if some of the bubbles grab our attention for a moment, we notice that a bubble has grabbed our attention. And we notice it in the context of the breathing around it. So even if something diverts our attention for a moment, we notice that diversion and come back. And recognize that as part of this process of mindfulness practice. The bubbles are not in our way. The bubbles and how we relate to them, well, that's what we came to see. This practice is about seeing how we are actually living, how we actually work with what life presents to us. Because we don't have a choice what life presents to us, but we have a choice how we work with it. So if we are sitting here and seeing what life is presenting to us, and we feel like that is somehow getting in the way, getting in the way of our practice, getting in the way of our life, well, that's how we're dealing with it, isn't it? We're dealing with it as an intrusion. And that's what we came to see. If we require that life only bring us certain things, we're going to run into a lot of difficulty. Because life doesn't care what our requirements for it are. So we're here to practice meeting life on its terms in the most skillful way possible. And sometimes that means at first we have to see how we're meeting life today. And perhaps seeing what we may be doing that isn't so skillful, isn't so effective. That may not feel pleasant, and so it can feel like an intrusion. But this is why I call my practice mindfulness in blue jeans. It's a blue-collar practice. We're going to get a little dirty sometimes. Not always necessarily going to like what we see. But it's what we came to see. So we can work with it. Let's take another moment or two to notice what breathing, what bubbles, what life is presenting itself right now. as you go through the rest of your day. Notice. What breathing? What bubbles? What life? Is presenting. And how we are receiving what is being presented. Simply breathing with the bubbles that are here. And seeing what happens. When we allow them to. Be the moving bubbles that they are. Let your practice be one of inquiry and discovery. This is what forms the basis of our clear seeing. So we can walk our paths with greater skill and ease. Thank you, everyone. I'll hang on for a couple of moments. We'll take a look at the chat if anyone has any questions or observations they'd like to share. So Farnaz, worry about having to leave my son now on his own, even though he's grown up, but I have to. How can I put that worry in a bubble? I don't think it's a matter of putting our worries in a bubble. It already is. The bubble metaphor that I use is one to represent that these things are processes. At any given moment, we have so much going on between sensations, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, all kinds of biological processes, all the information that we are taking in from the outside world, our inside world. There's the breathing itself. There's so much going on. But what happens very often is we hyper-focus on one particular thing. And that tends to dominate our awareness. So if there's a particular thing that we are worrying about, it can seem like that's the only thing that's happening. And we become consumed by that and start to miss that there are so many other things going on in that moment. I remember my first teacher, the psychologist who got me started, once relayed a story about how he was asked by someone at one of his sessions, one of his group sessions, about what it was that they were supposed to be doing during a sitting. And so he says to the person, well, what's going on when you sit and observe? And the guy says, well, nothing's happening. And my teacher says to him, nothing's happening. Really? You're sitting here, a living, breathing organism with billions of neurons firing in your brain every second. Clearly, many different processes happening to keep you alive, of which the breathing itself is just one. Nothing's happening. Look at all of the stuff going on that has been considered nothing because, it's not, something exciting, a video to watch or something, right? All these things that are nothing because we're simply not paying attention to them for so long that when the time comes to sit and pay attention, even then, we don't even see them. So when something that is worrying arises, it seems like it's the only thing in the world. Not because it is, not even close, but because we are ignoring everything else and hyper-focusing on this one thing that is unpleasant. But instead of simply noticing that it is one unpleasant thing amongst so many other things that are happening, some of which might also be unpleasant, some of which could be pleasant, some of which neither pleasant nor unpleasant. But noticing that it's just another process amongst so many other processes that are happening right now. So instead of identifying wholly with this one thing and creating misery out of unpleasantness, we notice it's a process. It's a bubble. We don't have to put it in a bubble any more than we have to make it a process. It already is. We're simply seeing it as it is. We don't have to do something to it. We don't have to fit it into the box that it is already in. We simply need to see that it's in that box. You don't have to think of it as a bubble if that doesn't work for you. That's simply a mental image that I work with sometimes. You may find something else that resonates better for you. Simply think of it as a process. Think of it as being in a bubble. Think of it as being in a box. What works for you? The point is noticing it's not the only thing going on. Expanding our view and seeing, oh, okay, hang on. What am I doing that's causing misery right now? Well, I'm taking this thing that's unpleasant and hyper-focusing on it and making it my entire life right now. Well, of course that's going to be miserable. That's what we came to see. is that we're doing that. This is what life is presented, and oh shit, look at what I'm doing with it. So we don't have to put it in a bubble. It's already in the bubble. We just need to see that. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to make it pleasant either. That's not what we're here to do. We're not here to try to force an unpleasant bubble to be pleasant. I'm not trying to talk ourselves out of it. Say, oh, okay, it's not so bad. It's just a bubble. It's not so bad. It can be an unpleasant bubble. Doesn't mean it's not in a bubble. Doesn't mean that it's not moving, shifting. It can be an unpleasant process. It's still a process. And it's still not us. Michelle says it nicely here. Not sure I'm a grandma and still have those worries. I don't think they'll go away. Just change based on their circumstances. That's exactly it. Change based on their circumstances. It's a process. It's a bubble. It's moving. It changes. Based on circumstance. And what are the circumstances? Well, some of the circumstances are, how are we working with it? Hypervigilantly focusing on just that one thing is a circumstance. A circumstance we are engaging in. Noticing it as a process or a bubble amongst many, many others is a circumstance. And if we experiment a little bit with each of those circumstances, we see, oh, well, one of these causes a lot of suffering that the other one doesn't. Still doesn't mean it's necessarily a pleasant bubble or a pleasant process, but we can manage what we do with that process, what we do with that bubble, and see what the results of changing those circumstances are. That's what we're doing here. Developing that clear seeing. Oh, when I do this, I get that. When I do that, I get that. Let's try this thing that doesn't cause so much suffering and see how that works out. Let's work with that. That clear seeing. It's a nice way to put it. Changes based on the circumstances. And the circumstances aren't always stuff out there. Circumstances, what we're setting. Causes and conditions we're setting. We have volition here. We have intent. We have the ability to think, speak, and act based on our intent. And then based on what we find, we can continue to adjust and refine our intent and our speech and our thought and our actions in ways that are more and more skillful. This is how we alleviate our suffering. That's why we're here doing this. Emily asking, don't challenge the thought. I wouldn't necessarily go that far. We can challenge the thought. There are times when a thought can arise and we can say, is this really accurate? You know, one of the issues that I've relayed sometimes that I fell into very often when I was housebound and consumed by panic and so forth, and which is not to say it doesn't still sometimes happen, but I work with it much more skillfully now. But an issue that I would run into very often is I would get a mental picture of something I was anticipating that was causing anxiety and would play through the scenario in my mind, of course, generating a worst case scenario, as we all do, in an attempt to be prepared for the worst, right? And then I would play that scenario right up until it came to the worst part. So peak nightmare scenario, you know, that absolute worst moment. And then I would freeze right there on that moment and hyper focus on it and scare myself that much more, right? In an attempt to stop feeling anxiety, right? So in an attempt to stop feeling anxiety, I'm scaring the shit out of myself. Right? And picturing this frozen mental image. Could anything be more opposite than a moving bubble than a frozen image? See, not only was I hyper-focused on this one thing at the expense of everything else that was happening, but I was also freezing it in place in my mind. And wondering why I was so riddled with panic and anxiety all the time. I mean, this is a perfect example of how I was causing my own suffering to the point I couldn't leave the house and was on disability. Life was presenting something, and good Lord, look what I was doing with it. So one of the things that the psychologist who got me stuck, this is, of course, when I very first started, and one of the things the psychologist said to me was, well, what is this worst case scenario? And I said, well, I'm having a panic attack. We were talking about me, potentially being out in public someplace. And he's like, so what would happen? It's like, well, I'd have a panic attack. And he says to me, well, understood. I'm not minimizing that. An extraordinarily scary, uncomfortable, unpleasant experience. He says, I'm not minimizing it. But then what? I said, what do you mean, then what? I said, I'd be having a panic attack. Hello? Like, panic attack. He's like, I understand. Not minimizing. Very uncomfortable. Very scary. Not denying that at all. But then what? And he just stopped talking. He was going to make me talk next. And I was eventually forced to admit, well, I guess at some point it would stop. He says, yeah. Because, it always had before, right? This is an example of that process of, hey, let this thing continue moving. Why are you holding this thing in place as if it's this frozen thing instead of a process? So that was an example of challenging the thought. Because there wasn't just the thought of having the panic. There was also the thought that at the peak moment of panic, it was going to be that way forever. Which, of course, is absurd. That's impossible. Never mind the fact that I'd been through it a number of times and it had never been permanent before, right? So I'd been confronted with plenty of evidence that this thought process was, well, bullshit, right? So there is a place for challenging and questioning our thoughts, our assumptions. But sometimes it's also enough to simply watch what they're doing. When we're not interfering, when we're not questioning directly, when the only question we're really asking is, what do these things do when we don't interfere? There's a place for that as well. Different techniques for different times. Again, changing the circumstances and seeing what happens. So yeah, there is a place for challenging the thoughts and challenging how we're handling the thoughts. Yeah, different kinds of inquiry. From Angela, I worry as I'm human, but I look back on my life when I did hyperfocus. Yeah, it led to being physically sick. I can absolutely identify with that. I won't get into it, but I've had a history with that as well. Yep, I recognize that. And now try to balance it, replace my worry with another thing or emotion. Yeah. A lot of what today's session was about is making space. Expanding our sphere of awareness. recognizing that we can make room for the bubbles, the processes that are here, and that there are other ones with them. So worry may be here, but it is, to a certain degree, up to us how much of our inner world that one process takes up. What happens when we bring our attention to one of the many other processes that are here? Usually starting with the breathing process, because we know that's here. And we also know that how we relate to the breathing affects how we relate to the other processes. Right? Because when we hyper-focus on something, are we breathing normally and comfortably? Not usually. Usually we're holding our breathing in, constricted. So it can be handy to bring our attention to the breathing process, which again I like to think of as being what is holding all of the bubbles, all of the other processes, giving them the space to move. And seeing, okay, when I bring my attention to the breathing process, what effect does that have? Do I perhaps start to notice more of the other bubbles that are around, such that my entire sphere of attention isn't completely taken up by this one thing? As if we were sitting in a movie theater and we got stuck in the front row and we're like right up against the screen and it's just taking up like the entirety of what we can see, right? Now we're coming back a bit. It's like, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole theater here. There's the screen and there's seats and there's other people and there's lights and you start to see, oh, look at all this other stuff going on. Gain a little bit of space. Breathing. Emily, I'm glad this resonated. Agoraphobia is hugely challenging to work with, but it is manageable in my experience. So I'm glad that this resonated for you. Thank you. Now, it looks like there's some people resonating with what I was describing about the frozen mental image. I know I'm not the only one with that. Yeah. Folks, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope to see you again soon. And have a great rest of your day. Cheers, everyone. Take care.